In some areas, certainly this is true in Turkey, but I would have to say it's also true in the Western Hemisphere and here in this country. People look at the movement and say, well, it's an Islamic movement. It must be up to something, and it must have some ulterior motive, some intention, and that causes suspicion. The old urban elites feel uncomfortable with recent arrivals from Anatolian villages, and they feel uncomfortable with their culture, their tradition, and certainly their religiosity, and they regard it in some way not only as inferior but even as threatening. Hence there are all these accusations made about movements like the Gulen movement that channels this traditional village religiosity. And it's certainly not an Islamist movement. It's unique. It's unquestionably, in my opinion, a progressive movement. It looks to the future with optimism and hope, even though it draws at the same time on the traditions of the past. But we still struggle for terms and for language to explain how it works. One aspect has to do with financing. As Helen Iba observed in her recent book, people are often asking the question, where does the money come from? Or to use an old Anatolian sort of image, where does the water for this mill come from? You know, what's driving it? Where's it flowing from? We look at the schools, and the schools are the most obvious aspect of the movement, and the schools are, well, they appear to be philanthropic, but they also charge fees. Some of them have quite high fees, and some of them are quite fancy. We look at the educational activities, and this is the key contribution of the movement, and struggle to try and know how to define them. We look at Fethullah Gulen himself, and it's difficult to know what to make of him. I would suggest the thing we need to understand is that he's not claiming to be a theological innovator. He's certainly a significant intellectual, but he's not making a claim of new ideas. What he is doing, though, and he's very modest, so he doesn't make this claim, but what he is doing is he's found a way of providing concrete pathways to activism for ordinary people. I think, this is the thrust of my paper, something that might help us in this regard is to understand the Gulen movement in the language that the Grameen Bank founder Muhammad Yunus uses. He speaks of, he's been described as a social entrepreneur, but he says, look, I would rather describe what I'm doing as social business. And I think that this social business model maps over very neatly into describing particularly the Gulen-inspired schools, but many of the other activities as well. I'm not suggesting that the social business model by any means fully accounts for how the Gulen movement works. I mean, we're discussing at this conference the religious ideas and inspiration and spiritual values. Those things are very important, and I fully agree with that discussion. I'm just suggesting that when it comes to the day-to-day functioning, we can see something from this model. I think beyond the financial models, there's other things that Fethullah Gulen and Muhammad Yunus have in common. And I don't want to press this too far, but it seems to me, although they're very different people in very different spheres, they have some similar convictions about human society and human nature. And one of them is they both have a very strong sense of hope. Hope has gone temporarily out of fashion in America, but let's hope it comes back quickly. I mentioned that the particular genius of Fethullah Gulen is providing this immediate pathway to engage a plumbing supply owner in rural Turkey with building of schools in Africa. I think that a part of the way that's worked out is this model, which I suggest could be described in terms of social business. Muhammad Yunus and Fethullah Gulen have very different languages. I mean, they come from different spheres. Yunus is a professional economist, a professor of economics turned accidental banker. Fethullah Gulen is a preacher and theologian who's come into the business of inspiring social movements. So obviously Yunus speaks in the language of economics and business. It's very secular. Fethullah Gulen is much more inclined to speak in the language of spirituality. But despite that very significant difference, there's some surprising parallels. Yunus is working closely with very poor rural people, and Fethullah Gulen is mostly reaching out to people who are urban-based and educated, and reaching out in a way that involves spiritual terms and language. I don't think that Muhammad Yunus and Gulen have ever met, and I suspect they don't know much about each other. I don't doubt that Fethullah Gulen is well aware of the Grameen Bank story, but it's unlikely they've ever exchanged any contact. And And yet it's interesting that coming from very different perspectives, they've arrived at, I think, a common point in the way that we address the needs of society. We want to understand the business dynamics of how many of the Gulen movement enterprises, so-called Hizmet enterprises, work. We could look at the model of Nobel Prize winner Muhammad Yunus, founder of Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, who suggests we start businesses deliberately to meet social needs, not to make money. These are not-for-profit businesses, but we try and do our social engagement work in a self-sustaining fashion. So that the businesses will pay for themselves and we can keep on expanding. And I think with the Hizmet schools we see something that's strikingly similar. The reason that there are fees and the reason that costs are paid is because this is not simply charity. There's so much need in the world that needs to be met that if we just take a charitable approach we'll soon run out of money. It strikes me as a particular stroke of genius to recognise that if we set out deliberately to meet social need but find a way of making it self-financing, we can do so much more good. And so I'm suggesting we might look at that model as a way of explaining what the Hizmet does.